Funding for Colores was provided in part by Frederick Hammersley Foundation, the Nelita E. Walker Fund for KNME-TV, KNME-TV Endowment Fund, KNME New Mexico PBS Great Southwestern Arts and Education Endowment Fund, and viewers like you. This time on Colores.
The Civil War was fought in 10,000 places, from Val Verde, New Mexico, and Tullahoma, Tennessee, to St. Albans, Vermont, and Fernandina on the Florida coast.
In this special 30-minute Colores, co-producer and editor Paul Barnes, known for his collaborations with Ken Burns on some of the most seminal work in the history of documentary filmmaking, shares his experience creating the Civil War.
What I really loved about it was that they took the attempt that they were going to look at it from all aspects, from all sides. And they wanted to get at the emotion of it. They wanted to get at the humanity of it, as well as the politics of it and the meaning of it.
First premiering in September 1990, The Civil War has been remastered for high-definition broadcast. It's all ahead on Colores. Paul Barnes shares the process of bringing a documentary to life.
Between 1861 and 1865, Americans made war on each other and killed each other in great numbers, if only to become the kind of country that could no longer conceive how that was possible. What began as a bitter dispute over Union and states' rights ended as a struggle over the meaning of freedom in America. At Gettysburg in 1863, Abraham Lincoln said perhaps more than he knew. The war was about a new birth of freedom.
Why is this story important to you?
The Civil War is a crucial part of American history, I believe. It occurred when we were still a very young nation, and we were founded as a nation with the original sin of slavery as part of our basis. From the time we became a nation until the war broke out, there were numerous attempts to come to terms with that. The country was beginning to come apart over that issue. I mean, how can you have a true democracy if a large part of the population is enslaved? It's just, it doesn't make any sense. It was a really tough issue and a very tough fight. And I think that, unfortunately, it was so hard that I don't think any measure of compromise or any measure of law making was going to be able to bring it to any kind of an end. It's almost as if we had to explode. The war had to take place in order to really address the issue and to really get rid of it as a part of our basis of who we were as a nation. Every once in a while there's a war that is a right war, that is fought for a really good cause, and that's necessary because there's not going to be any way to eradicate a problem unless it happens. And it's unfortunate, and I hate war. I mean, I'm totally anti-war. But I have to say that the Civil War was a war that this nation had to fight.
How does one tell the story of war?
Well, the thing that I loved about working on the film, and I was the principal editor. You know, I didn't write it. Jeffrey C. Ward and Rick Burns and Ken wrote the script. Ken and his brother Rick conceived the whole project. Ken directed the whole film. It was really their project. But what I really loved about it was that they took the attempt that they were going to look at it from all aspects, from all sides. And they wanted to get at the emotion of it. They wanted to get at the humanity of it, as well as the politics of it and the meaning of it. And so they looked at it from top down, from Lincoln and Lee down, and they looked at it from bottom up with the common foot soldiers and the slaves who were involved in this struggle. They looked at it from the north, from that side. They looked at it from the perspective of the south as well. Mary Chestnut is a wonderful character in the film, and so that you see what the Southerners went through with this huge eruption in their culture and in where they lived and how they had to face those horrors on a daily basis. but even the changes that they were beginning to think about in terms of why this eruption happened. And so the multifaceted part of telling the story was wonderful to me. I always loved history and filmmaking. And so working with Ken is like the ideal for me. It's like both of my loves combined.
Right.
You know, it's a perfect job. And, but I have to say, all the stuff I learned about the Civil War in history classes in middle school, high school, and college, it didn't match the experience of making the film. I think that the letters that they were, and diaries that they were finding to make voice excerpts from were so extraordinary to me. The language was so beautiful. And it brought those characters to life in such wonderful ways that I suddenly understood the history so much better because it was personalized.
The Civil War was fought in 10,000 places, from Valverde, New Mexico and Tullahoma, Tennessee, to St. Albans, Vermont, and Fernandina on the Florida coast. More than 3 million Americans fought in it, and over 600,000 men, 2% of the population, died in it.
How do you start? What's the process?
Oh, Lord. Well, we never start without a script. Ken refuses to start to edit without having a really solid draft of the script. And so the script has often gone through maybe 3, 4, 5 drafts before he lets the editors begin to cut. Until he's happy with the overall shape on paper. But again, it's on paper, it's not the full thing. Once you start to put the music and the images to it, suddenly it takes on a different life, and a different life of its own, a different dynamic. And so you keep changing and shaping those elements together between the audio, between the visuals, between the music, between the sound effects, until you get the right kind of blend. But it's a constant process, the editing process. I mean, we're changing and drafting new cuts and new sequences all the time. And Ken is a master of that in the cutting room. He still amazes me when he comes in because he's such a great storyteller, but he's also a great storyteller on film.
Exactly at 1 o'clock, a giant artillery barrage intended to soften up the Union defenses before the attack began with a deafening explosion. Meade had just left his commanders finishing their lunch. As an orderly served them butter, a shell tore the man in two.
The storm broke upon us so suddenly that numbers of soldiers and officers who leaped from their tents or lazy siestas on the grass were stricken in their rising with mortal wounds and died, some with cigars clamped between their teeth, some with pieces of food in their fingers.
The flying iron and pieces of stone struck some men down in every direction. About 30 men of our brigade were killed or wounded. Elijah Hunt Rhodes.
To keep up his men's courage, General Winfield Scott Hancock rode up and down the line without flinching at the screaming shells. A brigadier urged him to take cover. Hancock refused. There are times, he answered, when a corps commander's life does not count. Union artillery began to fire back.
We sat and heard in silence. What other expression had we that was not mean for such an awful universe of battle? All in the rear of the crest for 1,000 yards was the field of the shell's blind fury. Ambulances passing down the Tarrytown Road with wounded men were struck. The hospitals were riddled. Frank Haskell.
Suddenly, the Union guns fell silent to conserve ammunition for the attack Meade was sure was coming, and to lure the enemy out into the open fields. It worked.
Can you speak a little bit about that captivating the imagination of the viewer?
Ken talks about part of his aesthetic being what he calls emotional archaeology. It's you dig up the past and you discover these treasures, but you don't want it just to be objects. You don't want it just to be a dull thing. It's like, what's the feeling? What's the emotion? What's the meaning behind it all? And so the whole attempt in making these historical films is to bring the past alive. And this technique that he has developed, I mean, it does it so beautifully because you're looking at these objects, these photographs, which are still, but you take a living a text that still has such life and vibrancy to it. You have a wonderful actor read that, and you combine that text over these beautiful photographs that you allow the audience to imagine that they are actually seeing newsreel in a certain way. One of the big challenges in making the Civil War was that the battles were hard to visualize. Photography was new. It was only 22 years old when the Civil War started. The lenses were slow, the cameras were cumbersome, you had to hold the shutter open forever to get an image, and if there was action in front of it, it would all blur. So there was no way to do action photographs during the battles. So it was photographs of empty battlefields before the battle started, or battlefields littered with bodies after the battles were over, or you had present-day live shots of the battlefields photographed in beautiful light in moody situations, or you had paintings. There were an awful lot of very good paintings done of Civil War battles that we could rely on. But again, they're all static, they're all still. What really brought it to life was to fill up the soundtrack with sound effects. So that we had gunshots and cannon fire and men shouting and running, and so that the soundtrack was more active than the visuals were.
When the first Southerners came within 200 yards, Union General Alexander Hayes told his men to fire. 11 cannon and 1,700 muskets went off at once. Entire regiments disappeared.
Can you speak a moment about language and the importance of language in this film?
The thing about Ken's films, language is always key. The text is as important to him as the visuals. And when I teach editing to my students, I often say that audio, sound is half your movie. And so part of the aesthetic that we have developed over the years in terms of editing is to pay as much attention to the text and the language in the text as to the visual choices. And Ken goes out of his way, and Jeff goes out of his way to select the most beautiful quotes from these letters and diaries, where the language is really rich and dynamic and emotional, so that the language itself draws the audience in. And then in terms of our visual style, when there's a great quote, we actually try to slow the visuals down. We don't overcut and throw a lot of images at the audience at once, but we'll just select 1 or 2 or 3 images to cover an entire quote, so that rather than distracting the audience and with a lot of changes visually, we try to get the audience's ears to work more and hear the text and the language more by letting them sit with an image and be comfortable with the image. Like the slow zooms in that Ken does on people's faces. Like when Lincoln is making an extraordinary speech, there's a long 1.5-minute zoom in on Lincoln during one of his inaugural speeches that it's so brave. I mean, who does a shot for 1.5 minutes
right.
with a complex speech going over it? But it's incredibly effective because you hear the words so much better. And by going in on this man's face, you also feel the emotion that's behind the intellect that wrote these words. And I think that the combination of the two works incredibly well. There's a wonderful quote of Frederick Douglass that kind of ends the introduction. And in the early drafts, in the early cuts, that quote wasn't there. It was in a different position in the film. And as we were working on it, Ken kept thinking, that is so key, what Douglass is saying. He decided to move it to be basically the end of the introduction, so that the final word of the way we introduce the film is given to Frederick Douglass. And it's a heartrending quote. It's about the sufferings of his people. He talks about the blood of his brothers and sisters, and that the institution of slavery, it's so vile to him. I mean, that's the nature of the quote at the end of the introduction. And we use this beautiful, it's an aerial across one of the rivers in the south with this sunset light on it, so that the water is like blood red and the banks are in a dark silhouette. It's a very, very moody image. when Douglas mentions the blood of his brothers and sisters, you see that in the water. There's an incredible correlation between the two things. When Ken was filming the interviews, he had heard about a 104-year-old woman who was in an old age home in Pennsylvania, I believe it was. Her name was Daisy Turner, and her father had been an ex-slave. And she was one of the oldest descendants still living in the late 1980s when Ken was making the film. And so, you know, he heard about Daisy, he read some articles about her, and you know, she could be very articulate about her heritage. And so we thought, let's go try and see what we can get from Daisy. And unfortunately, the day they got there, because she's 104 years old, her mind wasn't as lucid that day. And they stumbled around with questions, and she wasn't giving him what he was hoping for and things he had read about in articles about Daisy. And they were about to stop and pack up and go, very disappointed. But then Daisy said, well, since you're here, do you want to hear the poem? And Ken said to Daisy, what poem? Right. She said, well, it's a Civil War poem about a soldier in the Civil War, and I can tell it to you. And he said, yes, absolutely. And Daisy just launched into this long narrative poem about this one soldier and his death during the Battle of Gettysburg. And just a continuous stream, no stumbling, no stopping, no ums and ahs, just, it's like she memorized it when she was 12 years old and she just never forgot it. And it was just extraordinary. When Ken showed me the footage in the cutting room, I was just blown away. I just thought, this is it's a gift. It's like a great treasure that you've captured here. And then he kept thinking, how can we use it? How can we use it? How can we use it? And you know, working with the scriptwriter Jeff, they figured out, why don't we? It was long. You couldn't hold the whole thing on screen the entire time. And so Ken and Jeff came up with the idea of breaking it up and using it as a way to frame the story of the Battle of Gettysburg. And so she became a structural device in a beautiful way for the entire Battle of Gettysburg sequence in episode 5 of the Civil War. It just lifted the film into a different dimension. You know, I mean, there was a drama and a poetry to it that was almost Homeric. And it was just, I mean, again, it's just, you know, part of the unexpected things that happen in production that become wonderful parts of the final project. That's so memorable.
How do you make a choice to leave something in or take something out?
It's a tricky decision, but it has to do, I think, with the vitality and the dynamic of it. If it's really hitting you hard, it's something that's going to stay. If there's any kind of weakness to it, if an actor's reading is weak of a quote, so that the language suddenly doesn't soar, we might remove it. You know, one thing that Ken always does when we're screening is that he puts himself into the position of the audience. He forgets who he is. He is making this film for a larger audience, and so he sits there and just says, "I'm a blank slate. I've never seen this before. I've never researched this before. Hit me with it." And it's a kind of an uncanny ability that he has. And he sits there and he's taking notes constantly on the script, and he'll cross out things that aren't working, and he'll check mark things that are great. And then as an editor, we sit, you know, we sit together and he'll say, this quote really doesn't work. Let's remove that one. Let's take this one that's down here, put it up in that position, and that has much more life to it. And because it's his film, he's directing it, that's his way of directing the editing throughout the course of putting the project together.
Well, tell me a little bit about the excitement around the restoration and the format for the restoration.
We've done the restoration of the Civil War for a number of different reasons. First of all, it's for preservation. I mean, not to pat myself on the back or pat Ken on the back, but I do think it's a classic American film. It's so widely used in classrooms still, middle school, high school, colleges all around the country. In fact, the statistics about how much it's used in classrooms has gone up over the years. It hasn't gone down. And it's a 25-year-old film. It still has the same kind of emotional effect on people who see it in the present day. We want it to live for further generations. And you know, the technology that created the film, the audio, the film is deteriorating. It's 25 years old. Some of the film is even, Ken started making the film 5 years before it was broadcast, so it's even 30 years old. The audio elements, the film elements are beginning to deteriorate, unfortunately. We took the original negatives in 16 millimeter, we scanned them onto 4K digital computer files, and then basically we reconstructed the entire film in a high definition version for broadcast using the 4K digital files. We also went through and completely color corrected the entire thing, so it's more beautiful than it's ever been. It's crystal clear. The focus is extraordinary. There's a funny thing in 16 millimeter called a film weave, where when you broadcast the film, you'd see a little bit of movement, almost like it was being you're rocking on a boat. We were able to stabilize the film weave, so now all of the images are rock steady when you see them. I think if you saw it 25 years ago, it's going to just look like something completely new. And I think your experience of watching it might be richer because of how beautiful it is. The Civil War series is it's a main way that a lot of people in America learn the history of the Civil War. Time and time again, people will tell us, you know, they learn from watching the series, not from reading books, unfortunately. You know, I mean, part of making these films is to draw people to read books and to learn more about their history. But again, if the starting ground is watching the Civil War, then it's so important that the next generation, the generation after, this preservation is going to allow the film to live that long.
What is really important for people to know about this production?
It was probably the major crisis in our nation's history. And at its root is race. The war was fought to free the slaves. The war was fought to give African Americans a better life in this country. And as we all know, after the Civil War, for all of Lincoln and the Republican Party's good intentions, Reconstruction was a miserable failure. And that race is still a major issue in this country that's still not resolved. Just the events in the past couple of years, I mean, it only brings it home even more. One of our historians, Barbara Fields, a historian at Columbia University, says in the introduction to the film that, you know, sadly the Civil War is still being fought, and sadly the Civil War can still be lost. And this is something she said 25 years ago when the film was first made. And unfortunately it's still true today. And I think that what's important about the Civil War is that it raises these issues. There's resonances from the history of the Civil War that resonate into the present. These issues of race are something that we need to know about, we need to think about, we need to talk about, we need to open up the dialogue, continue the communication about where we're going as a country in relation to race.
What can stories add to that conversation?
I mean, I think one of the beauties of the Civil War is the through line of the slave experience. From ordinary slaves whose letters and diaries still survived, we use these wonderful quotes. Frederick Douglass is a main figure throughout the series. And I think when you hear these voices and them telling their own stories, one slave named John Boston, you know, who escaped from the South, went north. His wife and son are still down there, and he writes his wife a letter saying how much he wants to fight and struggle to get her and their son back into freedom. I mean, it's a brief passage from a letter, but it's so powerful. And I think that those kinds of stories that thread through the whole Civil War series brings the experience of African Americans in this country to life. And that it's, I think, only going to increase people's empathy, so that people of color are no longer the other. I mean, it's always the attempt when we deal with race in our films to humanize and to make people realize the experience of so many of the historical figures we've dealt with in our films, from Frederick Douglass to someone like Jack Johnson, the boxer, in the film we made about him. The race issues that come up in the Roosevelts. It's a part of the American fabric. And it's still something that I think we're still trying to heal.
Why tell stories?
Stories are a way to learn. It's a way to increase people's understanding. It's a way for people to empathize with other human beings from time immemorial. I think that's why we tell stories. And it shows the good side of our natures, it shows the bad sides of our nature. And you can learn lessons from both. And I think the more that you hear these stories, you see these stories, you take these stories in, you understand these stories, you feel these stories, the more empathy that you're going to create within yourself as a human being. I think that's why it's so important. And again, it's the kind of, because the Civil War has so many aspects and sides to it, you can feel and see from all these different points of view, you know. You feel what Lincoln is feeling, what Grant is feeling, what Lee is feeling, what Mary Chestnut is feeling, what John Boston or Frederick Douglass is feeling. And you feel the kind of hopes and aspirations and successes and failures that all of these individuals had in dealing with this crisis in American history. And I think it's an incredibly rich experience. And I think that what you take away from that is something that can be applied to today. We need to know our history. We need to know who we are as a people. We need to know who we are as a nation. We need to know why we were founded. We need to know what those ideals were. We need to figure out how to make those ideals become real, and not just meaningless words on a piece of paper. And that's why we make these films.
Next time on Colores, acclaimed Albuquerque landscape painter Betty Sabo saw painting as a way to express emotion.
Nobody does adobes and snow like Betty. I can't tell you how many people do them, probably 1,000. So when you say what makes her work different or what, it isn't, but it's better.
The man who won't live without love, Peter Asher, has moved effortlessly from hit musician to powerful producer.
This is the short acoustic version, the home version of Well Without Love. Please lock me away and don't allow the day.
Creative Hub MPAC hosts cutting-edge artists and performances.
The particularity of MPAC is that for visual artists especially, who normally have the constraints of like a white cube gallery space, is here the limits are taken away from them.
Indie band Dave Bucher and the Historians share the process of producing an album.
You want to make a certain kind of music and you want to record it and you want it to be good. It's all dependent on how hard you work.
Until next time, thank you for watching. Funding for Colores was provided in part by Frederick Hammersley Foundation, the Nelita E. Walker Fund for KNME TV, KNME TV Endowment Fund, KNME New Mexico PBS, Great Southwestern Arts and Education Endowment Fund, and viewers like you.